Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back in time and explore a subject that is both fascinating and, let's be honest, a little bleak. But don't worry, we're not going for shock value. We're going for the kind of slow, strange history that makes your eyes heavy while you wonder how humanity has survived it all. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and maybe wrap yourself in a blanket. Because tonight we're talking about what ancient people did with unwanted babies. Yes, that's right. Before Pampers, before strollers, before parenting books titled How to Raise a Genius in 12 Easy Steps, there were entire civilizations trying to figure out what to do when a baby was born at the wrong time, in the wrong place, or with the wrong features. Spoiler, a lot of their solutions were not exactly heartwarming. Now, before we dive into the ancient world, let's just pause to remember that modern ideas of childhood and parenthood are actually pretty new. In most of human history, children were seen less as precious snowflakes and more as economic gambles. A baby was a potential farmhand, soldier, or maybe just another mouth that nobody asked for. So when society had too many mouths, well, some very creative and sometimes very horrifying methods came into play. Let's start with the ancient Greeks, because, of course, the Greeks had a system for everything: democracy, theater, and apparently also for baby disposal. In classical Athens, if you had a child you didn't want, you could legally practice what they called exposure, which sounds very sophisticated, but really just means leaving the baby outside somewhere. On a hillside, by a road, maybe next to a temple, or basically anywhere you could deposit your tiny human and walk away. The logic was simple. Maybe the gods would intervene, maybe someone else would come by and adopt the child, or maybe nature would take its course. The key thing here is that exposure was technically less about killing a baby directly and more about shrugging and letting fate decide. Because nothing says responsible parenting like outsourcing the decision to the universe. And this wasn't even considered shameful. Famous philosophers, yes, those same men who wrote deep treatises about justice, love, and the ideal society, were also casually okay with the idea of dumping a newborn on the side of the road if it didn't fit the family plan. Aristotle, for instance, suggested that deformed children should simply not be raised. That's in his Politics, in case you're looking for the feel-good read of the century.
Now, it's not all doom and gloom, because some exposed babies did survive. Sometimes they were picked up by strangers who wanted a child. Sometimes, and here's where the snark comes in, they were scooped up by people who wanted free labor. Because, of course, the charitable adoption system of the ancient world wasn't exactly about warm hugs and bedtime stories. If a random shepherd or city dweller picked up an abandoned baby, that child might be raised as a servant or sold into slavery later on. Congratulations, you made it through exposure, only to get drafted into the most underwhelming career path possible. The Romans naturally took this idea and added their own flair. Roman law made it very clear. A father had the right to accept or reject a newborn. The mother could do all the hard work of pregnancy and birth, but in the end, Dad got to decide if the baby was worthy to join the family. If he picked the baby up and held it, welcome to the clan. If not, off the baby went, usually to the trash heap or to be left by the roadside. And just so you know, Roman trash heaps weren't exactly symbolic. Archaeologists have actually found the remains of infants in ancient dump sites, which means exposure wasn't just a rumor, it was very much a practice. Though, as in Greece, these babies could sometimes be collected by others. And once again, a disturbingly high percentage ended up in slavery, especially in Rome's bustling urban centers. It was like a grim recycling program, only instead of bottles and cans, it was unwanted children. But, and this is important, not everyone thought this was fine. Ancient sources do tell us that some people were deeply disturbed by the practice. Christian communities in Rome, for example, became known for collecting exposed infants and raising them, often as members of their growing religious group, which, on the one hand, saved lives. On the other hand, it also expanded the congregation. So yes, there was moral concern, but also some very practical recruiting involved. Let's float over for a moment to ancient Sparta, because of course we can't talk about unwanted babies without mentioning them. Sparta had a whole reputation for being, let's say, selective. Their society was basically one long boot camp, so you can probably guess how they treated newborns. If a baby didn't look strong enough, elders would examine it and decide whether it should be kept. Weak or deformed infants were taken to a chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetus. And no, that's not metaphorical. They literally had a place for discarding babies who didn't meet the Spartan standard. Imagine being born only to immediately fail the world's harshest gym membership test. The Spartans justified this by saying that weak children would not only be a burden to the state, but also a danger in war. Which is ironic because this was a society where the average life expectancy was somewhere around 30. But hey, why not double down on selective survival when half your warriors were already going to be lost to battle? Efficiency over empathy, I guess. Meanwhile, other cultures had their own systems. In ancient China, exposure and abandonment were also common, especially with female infants. Sons were seen as future workers and heirs, while daughters were often considered economic drains. Records show that some families would abandon baby girls in baskets on rivers or leave them at temples. Again, the idea of fate or divine intervention softened the reality. If the gods wanted the child to live, someone would come along. If not, well, nature made the decision for you. And here's the strange thing. While this all sounds absolutely horrifying to us now, for most ancient societies, it wasn't considered extraordinary. It was just part of family planning, ancient style. Contraception was limited, abortion was dangerous, and poverty was constant. Exposure was seen as a last resort tool. And for elites, it was also a way to control inheritance. Too many sons meant too much division of land. Too many daughters meant too many dowries. So unwanted babies simply didn't make the cut. Let's pause here and let that sink in, because it gives us such a stark picture of how differently ancient people thought about life. To them, the survival of the household or the state came first. Individual infants were sadly expendable. And yet, somehow, out of all this exposure, abandonment, and grim practicality, human society kept moving forward. Babies survived, sometimes against all odds, and grew up to shape the civilizations we study today. Which makes you wonder, how many influential leaders, poets, or philosophers might have been one exposed baby away from never existing at all?
So we've left behind the world of ancient exposure, Greek hillsides, and Roman trash heaps. Let's float forward into the Middle Ages, because, you guessed it, unwanted babies didn't magically stop being a problem just because people started building castles and painting saints on church walls. In fact, the medieval period came up with its own, let's say, creative solutions. First, it's worth remembering that medieval Europe was deeply religious. On paper, at least, everyone was Christian, and Christianity taught that every soul was valuable, which sounds like great news for newborn survival rates. But here's the catch. Just because the church taught compassion didn't mean poverty suddenly disappeared. If you were a peasant family already scraping by on a diet of bread, turnips, and the occasional onion, an extra baby might tip the household from survival to disaster. And so, despite the sermons, abandonment still happened. One of the most telling signs of this problem is the rise of foundling hospitals. These were institutions, often run by the church or wealthy patrons, specifically for abandoned children. Think of them as medieval orphanages, though with considerably less Disney magic. One of the most famous was the Ospedale degli Innocenti in Florence, founded in 1445. The name literally means Hospital of the Innocents, which is both tender and slightly guilt-trippy. This Florentine hospital had a rather ingenious and disturbingly efficient system for anonymous baby drop-offs. They built a rotating wooden wheel in the wall, known as a foundling wheel. Imagine a kind of medieval lazy Susan. A mother could place her baby inside, spin the wheel, and voila! The baby was inside the convent or hospital, safe from the eyes of gossiping neighbors. The mother never had to be seen. A discreet, roundabout way of saying, "Here, you deal with it." These wheels, by the way, were not unique to Florence. They popped up across Italy, France, Spain, and even parts of Germany. The concept was the same everywhere. Make it possible for desperate parents, often unwed mothers, to abandon a child without public shame. Because if there's one thing medieval society excelled at, it's piling shame onto women who got pregnant outside of marriage. Now, let's talk about those unwed mothers for a second, because medieval Europe was obsessed with lineage, inheritance, and chastity. Having a baby outside of wedlock was a social catastrophe. Nobles might quietly arrange for the infant to be spirited away, hidden in a convent, or, in some cases, smothered and forgotten. Peasants, on the other hand, might have fewer options. For them, abandonment at a church door was often the only way to keep both themselves and the child alive, even if survival rates for those children weren't exactly stellar. And here's the ironic twist. The church condemned infanticide, but also punished the social conditions that made abandonment necessary. It's the medieval version of, don't do it, but also, we won't make it easy for you not to do it. Classic catch-22.
Speaking of hypocrisy, let's talk about the aristocracy. Noble families, of course, had their own way of dealing with inconvenient children. Illegitimate offspring of kings, dukes, and bishops, and yes, bishops, because vows of celibacy were more like suggestions, were often quietly sent off to monasteries or nunneries. Sometimes they were raised as minor courtiers. Sometimes they were hidden so effectively that we only know about them from scandalous whispers and chronicles. Take the case of medieval kings with entire armies of bastards. Henry I of England, for example, was said to have fathered around 20 to 25 illegitimate children. That's not exactly oops territory, that's a full-blown dynasty. Most of those kids were tucked away into advantageous marriages or monasteries, but you can bet that some unwanted infants were quietly erased from the record. After all, you can't exactly advertise royal surplus children in the family tree. Meanwhile, common people had more practical, if depressing, methods. Records from medieval courts in England and France show cases of suspected infanticide, usually involving desperate mothers accused of smothering or drowning newborns. And while the church thundered against such acts, communities often turned a blind eye. Everyone knew the economic pressures. Everyone knew the shame attached to illegitimate birth. Sometimes silence was easier than scandal. And then there were the convents. Oh yes, convents were not just places for pious prayer and candle-making. They were also storage facilities for inconvenient daughters and occasionally their inconvenient babies. A noble family might quietly send a young woman who had made a mistake into the cloister, where the child would either be raised by the nuns or sent off to a foundling hospital. It was essentially damage control dressed in a habit. We should also talk about the symbolism of naming in these foundling hospitals. Abandoned babies were often given surnames like Innocenti, Esposito, Italian for exposed, or Trovatelli, foundling. So imagine growing up and having your last name literally advertised to the world that you were abandoned. Subtle? Not exactly. But then again, medieval Europe was never known for its sensitivity. Let's drift over to early modern Europe, because things got even more bureaucratic. By the 16th and 17th centuries, city governments started formalizing systems for abandoned infants. Paris, for instance, saw tens of thousands of babies dropped off at the Hôtel Dieu and other institutions. So many, in fact, that entire wards of hospitals were dedicated to them. Mortality rates, though, were heartbreakingly high. In some foundling hospitals, only 1 in 10 babies survived to adulthood. But hey, in the eyes of society, at least they weren't abandoned in the street. That's progress, I guess. The irony, of course, is that some of these unwanted children did grow up to leave a mark. A number of famous courtesans, church leaders, and even a few artists began life as abandoned infants. Which really drives home the point. History could have been one anonymous spin of the foundling wheel away from turning out very differently. So, from medieval peasants hiding shame under cloaks to aristocrats sweeping illegitimate babies into convents, the story of unwanted infants kept repeating. Society condemned the practice but quietly made space for it anyway. It was the awkward secret of the Middle Ages. Everyone knew it was happening, nobody wanted to talk about it, and yet entire institutions were built around it.
So we've arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries, a time when powdered wigs were tall, philosophy was fashionable, and apparently so was continuing the tradition of not knowing what to do with extra babies. You might think that by the Enlightenment, with all its grand talk about reason, rights, and the dignity of man, society would finally have solved this very basic problem. Spoiler, it didn't. If anything, these solutions became more industrial, more bureaucratic, and occasionally more horrifying. Let's start in 18th century France. Paris, for example, had such a serious infant abandonment problem that the authorities basically threw up their hands and said, "Fine, let's just make it official." They expanded the foundling hospital system into something almost industrial. Babies were carted in by the thousands, literally. At one point, records suggest that about 1/3 of all babies born in Paris ended up in a foundling home. Imagine being a midwife and just casually assuming, yeah, this one's probably going straight to the Hotel Dieu. And if you're wondering what the survival rate was, not great. Foundling hospitals became infamous for their staggering infant mortality. In some institutions, only about 1 in 5 babies survived beyond their first year, which meant the system wasn't so much about raising children as it was about providing a socially acceptable place for them to disappear. It was almost like a civic version of exposure, only with paperwork and wet nurses. Now, this wasn't just a French problem. Across Europe, foundling hospitals multiplied. London had the famous Foundling Hospital, established in 1739 by Thomas Coram. It became a kind of charity showcase, with famous benefactors like Handel giving concerts to raise money. So yes, orphans were now backed by Baroque music. But despite the high ideals and pretty fundraising, the reality was still grim. Many babies didn't survive, and those who did often grew up in institutions where life was more regimented than nurturing. One detail I love, and by love I mean deeply bleak, is the token system at the London Foundling Hospital. When a mother left her baby, she was encouraged to leave a small token, a coin, a trinket, even a scrap of cloth, so that if she ever came back, she could identify her child. Of course, most never did. So today, museums display these tiny objects, heartbreaking reminders of mothers who hoped, at least briefly, for a reunion that almost never happened. Meanwhile, in less urban, less institutional contexts, unwanted babies were often absorbed into the phenomenon of baby farming. And no, baby farming wasn't a whimsical nursery rhyme situation. It was exactly what it sounds like. People, usually women, who offered, for a fee, to take in unwanted infants and care for them. Sometimes this was done with good intentions, sometimes. Other times, baby farmers simply took the money and didn't exactly prioritize the whole keeping the baby alive part.
In Victorian England, baby farming scandals became notorious. One of the most infamous figures was Amelia Dyer, a woman who ran baby farms in the late 19th century and was eventually hanged for murdering infants in her care. She's often called Britain's most prolific serial killer, which is just a chilling reminder of how desperation and lack of social safety nets created fertile ground for exploitation. Of course, not all baby farms were homicidal. Some genuinely did keep children alive, often raising them for domestic service or factory work later on. But the very existence of this system tells us how widespread the problem was. Too many babies, too few resources, and an economy that made children both a burden and eventually a commodity. And speaking of commodities, let's drift into the Victorian workhouse. If you've ever read Oliver Twist, you'll know that workhouses were essentially warehouses for the poor. And yes, unwanted babies ended up there too. A woman who couldn't feed her child might hand it over to the local parish workhouse, where it would be raised, if you can call it that, under conditions of near starvation, overcrowding, and constant moral lectures. Nothing says welcome to life quite like being born into Dickensian poverty with a side of gruel. The Industrial Revolution, with all its soot and steam engines, only made the problem more visible. Cities were crowded, wages were low, and illegitimate births carried heavy stigma. Women working as domestic servants, for example, were especially vulnerable. If they became pregnant, they were often fired. With no income and no support, many of them turned to foundling hospitals, baby farmers, or outright abandonment. London newspapers from the 19th century are filled with reports of infants discovered in alleyways, parks, and even the Thames. It was exposure all over again, just with more brick chimneys in the background. And here's where the Enlightenment rhetoric becomes almost comical. Philosophers and reformers were writing about the rights of man, the dignity of the human person, and the natural innocence of childhood. Meanwhile, just outside their salons, babies were being handed through rotating wheels, dropped at hospitals, or left in baskets. The contrast is almost too on the nose. It's like declaring the age of reason while standing knee-deep in unreasonable social problems. To be fair, some reformers did try to improve things. Efforts were made to standardize care, to regulate wet nurses, and to encourage fostering rather than institutionalization. But change was slow, and mortality remained high well into the 19th century. By then, the idea of childhood as a special, protected stage of life was finally starting to catch on in middle-class circles. But for the poor, unwanted babies were still trapped in a grim cycle of abandonment, neglect, and exploitation. So, if ancient exposure was a shrug at fate, and medieval foundling wheels were a cloak of shame, the Enlightenment and Victorian era added a new twist: bureaucracy and industrialization. Babies weren't just unwanted, they were processed, cataloged, shuffled, and often forgotten. Society had built entire institutions for them, but the institutions were often just as indifferent as the hillside of Mount Taygetus. Only now there were ledgers, tokens, and official stamps to record the loss.
So here we are, the 20th century, a time of jazz, world wars, neon signs, and, yes, still plenty of unwanted babies. You'd think with all the advances in medicine, psychology, and social welfare, the world would have finally solved this problem. And in a way, it tried. But as usual, the solutions weren't quite as tidy as the progress brochures suggested. Let's start with one of the most important shifts, the rise of the welfare state. After centuries of leaving poor mothers and unwanted children to fend for themselves, governments in Europe and North America began introducing safety nets. Maternity benefits, family allowances, and later welfare payments were designed to prevent desperate abandonment. In theory, no one should have to leave a child at a church door anymore. In practice, well, stigma and poverty didn't vanish overnight. Adoption, for instance, became the go-to modern answer, and here's where the language got an upgrade. Instead of exposure, abandonment, or foundling wheels, societies now talked about placing a child for adoption. It sounded more dignified, more deliberate, less like dropping a baby on a doorstep at midnight. Adoption agencies sprang up across the Western world, promising to match unwanted children with loving families. And sometimes, yes, it worked beautifully.
But, as always, there was a darker side. Many early 20th century adoptions were less about the child's welfare and more about social appearances. Unmarried mothers, still burdened with enormous shame, were often pressured or outright coerced into giving up their babies. Institutions run by churches or charities became infamous for strong-arming young women into signing adoption papers. In Ireland, for example, the notorious Magdalen laundries and mother and baby homes took in fallen women and often separated them permanently from their infants. Babies were sent abroad, frequently to the United States, and the mothers never saw them again. And this wasn't just Ireland. Similar practices happened in Britain, Australia, Canada, and the United States. For decades, illegitimacy was treated as a problem to be solved quietly by removing the evidence. Whole generations grew up in adoptive families, never knowing they had been unwanted, not by their mothers, but by a system that gave their mothers no real choice. Meanwhile, other solutions cropped up. In some countries like Germany and France, governments revived a medieval idea but gave it a modern twist: the baby hatch. Yes, that's right. In the late 20th century, cities reintroduced something strikingly similar to the old foundling wheels. Hospitals or safe houses installed boxes or heated compartments where a mother could place her infant anonymously. No questions asked, no police, no stigma. The baby would be collected and given medical care and hopefully placed for adoption. It was Exposure 2.0, just with central heating and better PR.
Now, across the Atlantic, America had its own complicated relationship with unwanted babies. In the early 20th century, baby trafficking rings actually flourished. Some shady adoption brokers made fortunes arranging under-the-table adoptions, sometimes outright selling infants to desperate families. The infamous Georgia Tann, who ran the Tennessee Children's Home Society from the 1920s to the 1950s, trafficked thousands of babies under the guise of adoption. Wealthy parents got a child, poor mothers lost one, and officials looked the other way until the scandal finally exploded. By mid-century, though, adoption began to professionalize. Laws were passed, agencies were regulated, and social workers got involved. The rise of psychology also reframed the issue. Children weren't just blank slates anymore. They were seen as individuals who needed stability, love, and consistent care, which meant, at least in theory, fewer unwanted babies vanishing into neglect and more being intentionally placed in stable homes. And yet, the problem never fully disappeared. The 20th century brought world wars, refugee crises, and famines, all of which produced waves of orphaned and abandoned children. After World War II, Europe was filled with displaced kids, many of them living in camps or institutions. Some were adopted abroad, others languished in orphanages. Photographs of skeletal, neglected children in Romanian orphanages after the fall of communism in 1989 shocked the world, a grim reminder that the unwanted child was still very much a reality. Even in prosperous countries, stigma lingered. Until the 1960s and 70s, unwed mothers in the United States and Britain were often hidden away in maternity homes, pressured into giving up their infants. Only with the rise of the women's rights movement did the practice begin to be questioned openly. By the 1980s and 90s, single motherhood became less taboo, contraception more available, and abortion more accessible. All of which meant fewer unwanted babies, at least in the traditional sense. Still, it's striking how much the old methods never really went away. From the exposed infant on the hillside, to the baby on the foundling wheel, to the Victorian baby farm, to the neon-lit baby hatch in modern hospitals. The pattern is hauntingly familiar. Different technology, different rhetoric, but the same underlying struggle. What happens when a society can't or won't provide space for every child born into it? So, by the end of the 20th century, humanity had wrapped this age-old problem in bureaucracy, psychology, and social work. We had agencies, laws, and entire philosophies of child welfare,
And yet, the uncomfortable truth remained. Unwanted babies never really vanished from history. They just kept finding new drop-off points.
So here we are, the 21st century. You'd think that with smartphones, space travel, and the ability to summon groceries to your door at 2 a.m., society would have finally solved the oldest family problem in the book. But no, the unwanted baby is still with us. Only now, the responses look like a strange mix of ancient tradition and modern technology. Let's start with safe haven laws. These began in the United States in the late 1990s and quickly spread. The idea is simple. If you have a newborn you cannot or will not raise, you can anonymously drop the baby off at a designated place, usually a hospital, police station, or fire station. No questions, no charges, no legal punishment. Just hand the baby over and walk away. Sound familiar? It should, because this is basically exposure, but with fireproof walls and an air-conditioned lobby. Instead of leaving your infant on a hillside and hoping a shepherd stumbles by, you leave it with an ER nurse in scrubs. It's the modern equivalent of shrugging and letting fate, now in the form of social workers, take it from there. And these laws do save lives. Abandoned infants found in dumpsters or public toilets have become far rarer in places with safe haven programs. But at the same time, critics point out that the system sidesteps deeper issues. Why are parents so desperate that they feel their only option is an anonymous handoff? Poverty, stigma, domestic violence, immigration status, all the underlying causes haven't gone away. The law just provides a socially acceptable escape hatch. Meanwhile, Europe and Asia still use the baby hatch model. In Germany, for example, baby clappus, baby boxes with heated beds, are installed in hospitals. A mother can place her child inside, ring a bell, and disappear. Japan has similar hatches, sometimes sparking public debate. Critics argue that anonymity denies children their right to know their origins, while supporters argue that survival beats sentimentality. The debate, of course, feels eerily similar to what Aristotle, the Romans, and the medievals were already hashing out, only now with more stainless steel and fewer goats wandering by. Now, let's talk about international adoption. By the late 20th and early 21st century, it had become a booming business. Western families eager to adopt often turned to countries in Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe, where poverty and instability produced large numbers of abandoned children. In many cases, these adoptions were genuine lifelines. Children from overcrowded orphanages in Romania, Ethiopia, or China found homes and opportunities they'd never have otherwise.
But, and you knew there was a but coming, scandals also abounded. Reports emerged of corruption in adoption agencies, baby trafficking, and even outright kidnapping disguised as abandonment. In Guatemala, for instance, investigators uncovered networks that pressured or tricked poor women into giving up their babies to meet Western demand. Suddenly, the line between rescuing unwanted children and exploiting desperate families blurred uncomfortably. And then there's China's one-child policy, which left an entire generation shaped by abandonment. For decades, parents, especially in rural areas, who had daughters they couldn't legally keep, often left them at orphanages, hoping they'd be adopted. Many of those children ended up abroad, especially in the U.S. Today, thousands of young adults are reconnecting with their birth families using DNA testing and social media. It's a 21st century twist. Ancient exposure meets 23andMe. The digital age has changed the conversation in other ways, too. In the past, abandoned children were anonymous, their stories hidden. Today, viral posts, crowdfunding campaigns, and online advocacy can turn an abandoned baby into a symbol of hope, tragedy, or even politics within hours. A child left at a baby hatch can become a trending hashtag. In some ways, that visibility brings compassion. In other ways, it risks turning very real human lives into fleeting online content. But here's the oddly comforting part. Unlike in the ancient or medieval worlds, most societies today don't shrug indifferently at unwanted babies. Even when the systems are imperfect, safe haven laws, adoption agencies, foster care, there's at least a cultural consensus that every child deserves a chance. That's new. For most of history, infants were burdens to be weighed against survival. Now, at least in theory, they're seen as individuals with rights. Of course, practice lags behind theory. Foster systems are overwhelmed. Adoption is expensive. Baby hatches still exist because desperation still exists. And yet, compared to the days of Roman trash heaps or Spartan cliffs, it's progress. Slow, uneven, but progress nonetheless. So if we zoom out, the story of unwanted babies is one of remarkable continuity. From ancient exposure to safe haven boxes, from foundling wheels to fire stations, from slavery to foster care. The methods keep changing, but the underlying tension remains the same. Societies have always struggled to balance compassion with practicality, and children have always paid the price. And maybe that's the final, slightly sleepy lesson here. The unwanted baby is not just a story about desperate mothers or cruel fathers. It's a mirror for every society, showing what it values, what it fears, and how much humanity it can muster when faced with its most vulnerable members.
So here we are, after wandering across millennia of human history, from Spartan cliffs to Victorian baby farms to neon-lit baby hatches in modern hospitals. And what have we learned? Well, besides the fact that humanity has a truly impressive talent for recycling the same solutions over and over, just with new branding. If you squint a little, you can see the same patterns looping endlessly. Ancient Greeks talked about exposure with a shrug. Medieval Italians built spinning wheels in convent walls. Victorians outsourced childcare to baby farmers. And today we pass laws for anonymous safe havens. Each era thought it was being pragmatic, compassionate, maybe even innovative. But really, it was just the same ancient instinct, dressed up in different cultural costumes. And it tells us something important about how societies actually work. Despite all the lofty talk, whether from philosophers in togas, priests in cathedrals, or politicians in tailored suits, people have always been juggling survival, shame, and practicality. Babies in that equation are both the most vulnerable and the least able to argue their case, so their fates have always depended less on ideals and more on what a community could manage in the moment. It's also striking how much of this story is about women, though often told by men. Fathers in Rome made the call about whether a child lived in the household. Medieval chroniclers scolded fallen women for their shame. Victorian moralists blamed servants for their pregnancies while quietly ignoring the employers who caused them. And yet it was usually mothers, scared, desperate, or silenced, who had to make the actual choices, whether slipping a baby onto a foundling wheel at midnight or walking into a modern safe haven box. That quiet thread of maternal desperation ties the whole narrative together, even when the records barely mention it. And then, of course, there's the irony. Entire societies spent centuries finding ways to get rid of children, only to later turn around and panic about not having enough of them. Ancient Rome fretted about declining citizen numbers. Early modern France worried about population after wars and plagues. Today, governments in Japan, Italy, and elsewhere are desperate to encourage higher birth rates. It's almost comical. One century, you're building foundling hospitals because there are too many infants. The next, you're offering tax breaks because there aren't enough. Humanity apparently is very bad at math. But maybe the most quietly remarkable thing is how often unwanted children did survive, and even thrive. Some grew up in convents and became scholars. Some worked their way up from servitude.
Some were adopted into new families or pulled from obscurity, or, in the modern age, reunited with their biological relatives through DNA tests and social media. Every exposed infant, every foundling, every anonymous adoption was, in theory, a life erased. And yet, history is full of examples of those erased lives reappearing, reshaping the very societies that once tried to discard them. So, what did ancient people do with unwanted children? The same thing medieval people did, the same thing Victorians did, and, in softer, more bureaucratic ways, the same thing we do now. They found ways to set them aside, to pass them off, to let someone else, or something else, decide. And while the details have changed, from cliffs to cradles, from trash heaps to hospitals, the story is less about progress than about repetition. A gentle reminder that history is not a straight line, but a very sleepy circle. And on that note, maybe it's time for us to close our eyes too. The past is heavy, sometimes bleak, but also strangely comforting in its predictability. People have always stumbled, always improvised, always found imperfect answers to impossible questions, and yet, somehow, humanity kept going. So take a deep breath. Let the centuries drift by. The hillsides, the convent doors, the workhouses, the baby hatches, they can all fade now, like dim lanterns receding into the dark. You don't need to carry them any further tonight. History will still be there tomorrow. Good night.